All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to this session on creating an effective and sustainable chapter budget at the NELA Chapters Leaders Preparation. So, on behalf of the SHIP Professional Chapter of the Twin Cities, I want to welcome you and I want to thank you for listening listening to our perspective and our approach to budgeting. My name is Alfredo Carduz, and I have been the treasurer for 2023-2024 fiscal year, and I'll be repeating into next year. So before we dive too deep into our content for today, let me tell you a little bit more about myself. So I came to the US. I'm originally from Venezuela and came to the US in 2015 for my undergraduate degree at Purdue. I trained as an industrial engineering technology. And during my time at Purdue as an intern, I met Cummins. Cummins is a company that manufactures power solutions for customers around the globe in power generation, engines, components, and many renewable sources of power. Through my time at Cummins, I have worked in a variety of roles, always related to manufacturing operations in quality and industrial engineering, in warehouse and logistics operations, done some project management, and just general support functions for manufacturing operations. I've had the luck or the privilege to work in 4 different locations, 4 different states across the U.S., Minnesota, Colorado, New York State, and then Indiana, where we are headquarters. And I am currently pursuing, actually just about finished with my master's degree in business analytics with a couple of concentrations in artificial intelligence and supply chain. So you'll see through my training or my day job, I am not an accountant or a finance professional by any means. Among the many benefits of SHIP, this has allowed me to stretch my skills and learn a lot of new things. If anybody in the room does have that training, please excuse me if I misuse some of the terms like income statements or anything along the lines. In terms of my SHIP involvement, I have been an active member and at some periods a little bit more dormant member, but since my time at Purdue as an undergraduate student. So like many of you maybe, I started as a general member of my student chapter, then led it from a VP standpoint in the 2017-2018 academic year. After graduating, I became a liaison through Cummins Purdue Recruiting for the SHIP chapter at Purdue. And then later on, I have taken on a little bit more of an active role as I established myself in the Twin Cities with the professional chapter. So I started by participating as a member, volunteering for some of the events. And then in the 2023-2024 season, I started my term as a treasurer that I will be repeating here into our next fiscal year. And then on the right, just a few things about me from where I grew up with my family. I love spending time with them and traveling. That picture is actually in Spain on a family trip. The center picture there is one of my hobbies growing up and still is playing soccer. That one's actually back home in Venezuela from a little bit ago. And then a hobby I picked up as I moved to the U.S. and live in colder states, which is skiing. So back to our topic for today, right? Creating an effective and sustainable budget for your chapter. A few of the things that we'll review today is the importance of budgets and why to do a budget from the get-go, how to get started, what I call an ongoing process and a repeatable iterative process of doing, maintaining, and reviewing your budget, a few maybe tips, tricks, lessons learned from our chapter and from my time as a treasurer that I think would help mitigate some of the risks related to your money management of the chapter, and then the importance of sustainability and handoff. And at this point, I'll say one of the reasons we have the privilege to represent the Twin Cities chapter here, and I have the privilege of presenting today. really comes back to the person that handed it off to me. And I'll give full credit. A lot of the tools that we're using, a lot of the reasons why it was a smooth transition and I was able to pick up skills that were new to me is because of how they enabled me, the previous treasurer. Her name is Juana, and her leadership team, her involvement in different positions and a lot of time and a lot of experience with the professional chapter here at the Twin Cities. So keep in mind sustainability, keep in mind that our terms are often short or moving around across different positions. And so making sure that the next person has enough visibility, enough traceability, enough understanding is a key element of how we develop and monitor our budgets throughout the year or throughout our term. That could be maybe multiple years. So why budgeting at all? The first part of why budgets are important really comes down to alignment on your chapter priorities. And it is truly, truly key to make sure that as a leadership team for a chapter representing professional members, engaging student chapters, supporting some of the SHIP national activities, you really are clear on what are you trying to accomplish. Because SHIP has a lot of wonderful programming. We all come to our SHIP engagement with a vision, with maybe an objective of delivering or fulfilling activities and programming throughout the year. And it can get hard to prioritize sometimes. So making sure that your budgets and your money you're putting your money where your mouth is as a team is very, very important because it'll help drive some of the priorities. So, and when we talk about priorities, we talk about being consistent in how we're making some certain decisions at certain times throughout the term, right? So it's often common to hear people in management positions, for example, say, oh, I don't have time for that, or I'll see if I can accommodate it or things like that. And one of the pieces of intelligence or knowledge bits that I absolutely love is don't let your schedule drive your priorities. Let your priorities drive your schedule. With money and with running a chapter, it's a similar thought, right? Don't let your money necessarily or what you have drive your priorities. Let your priorities inform and drive how you plan for your money. And so I think those are critical elements to think about in how you'll be consistent in decision making. And we'll dive a little bit into more detail about that as we talk about tools and getting started and some of those things. What I mean by the power of flexibility is really making decisions and making adjustments as the year comes along. So we'll all start this process, come July when you transition into a new position or you take over from the previous person, doing the role, executing certain things, and come at it with a vision. Think we have a plan. Throughout the year, many things can happen to pull you away from that plan. So how do you react? What do you pick if you have multiple scenarios and you are limited in resources to maybe completing one or two, or maybe just a combination of multiples, but not everything as you had originally intended? And having a good grasp from the beginning, having that alignment, having that understanding of what you really wanted to accomplish as a team will enable you to take decisions that can adjust and be flexible throughout the year and throughout your term as a chapter leader. So that's great. And budgets are important, and we can all agree, and by being in this session, you're probably interested in agreeing that having a budget is essential to your chapter. But how do you get started, right? And we'll start with this first point about having just plain English conversations about those goals, those objectives. It's common to think, okay, budgets, and you start thinking about numbers and you start thinking about cost or how much can I spend here or how much income can I get from this source or that source. But really the starting point, or our recommendation for the starting point, is to have a plain English discussion. Is, hey, I want to do this 3 events. Or, hey, I want to take this many people to the national convention. Or, hey, we really want to have Noche de Ciencias as a flagship and then Equipando Padres. And for us, it's important to do this much in scholarships this year, right? And so have some of those conversations of there's many things that you can accomplish as a chapter. There's some requirements that you must accomplish as a chapter, but what do those mean? What's the scale of your chapter? How many members are you trying to cater to in your programming? And understanding those as a team is going to be critical, right? So make sure you have these conversations to kickstart your budgeting process. The next step that we would recommend is to look at your historical records. This is, in my case, and I may be lucky, this is look at previous budgets. Look at what has the chapter done and accomplished in the past. What is the scale? Are we talking tens of thousands? Are we talking a couple thousand? Are we talking hundreds of thousands, right? Because there's a difference in some of those in how you'll plan and how you'll execute the level of the magnitude that you're performing at potentially, or what's in scope in your role as a treasurer for the organization. But look at what's recorded, what's documented. In many cases, we'll recommend having receipts. We'll recommend having further breakdowns beyond your high-level budget for specific programs. We'll recommend having anything that's been invoiced or purchased through the chapter's money, essentially through your chapter's accounts, relevant ledgering, relevant statements, things along those lines. You'll want to make sure that you can reference those. And in many instances, also reference the tribal knowledge, right? There's a lot of knowledge that is within the chapter of members that may have been a part of the chapter in the past, of members that may be repeating but in a different role or slightly different function, slightly different scope, trying on a different thing. Leverage them, right? And leverage what they know, leverage what they've done or what they've seen done by others in your current role. What do we mean by understand your business ecosystem? So think about, how many sponsors have you had in the past? How have you secured your income in the past? What are some of the partnerships that you've managed to develop in your local network? What are some of those tools that you could use and leverage as you execute your financial operations for the chapter? And then it's very, very important in your hand of meeting for the healthy upkeep of your chapter to understand if you have previous commitments, right? Previous commitments could be financial commitments, or it could be, for example, somebody that sponsored you in the past and you've committed to displaying logos, to posting jobs, to engaging membership, to website airtime or things like that. And you'll want to make sure that you can be held true to those previous commitments, even if they have been made by the previous board, because that can enable or maintain your good relationship and good standing with those local partners. So going from that starting point to the ongoing process, how do you break it down from the high level, from the plain English, to what will become what essentially for our chapter has looked like an income statement? Starting at the top with your income, with your revenue, with how you're bringing money into your chapter, followed by different sections that break down your spending, your planned programming, your administrative spending, any big ticket items that you'll want to highlight as part of your high level. And then where does that put you from a financial standpoint? Are you covering your expenses for the year? Do you need to go get more money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So a good point to start is what applications do you have access to, right? So in many of our chapters, we'll do business using PayPal. We'll do business using Venmo. We'll do business using Zelle or other even banking means of execution, right? Nowadays, leverage your spending tracker of your banking application, whether any of our big banks that are bank solutions will likely generate and provide some of these tools for you. So ask around, have a meeting with your banking representative, right? Sometimes they have seen nonprofit organizations do and run and financially plan or execute their operations, and they can provide some insights. So make sure to leverage those where possible. Make sure that you have the right tools and templates. So SHIP will provide through this chapters or certified chapter leaders certification, an opportunity to workshop some tools and leverage a template. If this doesn't work to your chapter, if you need something more detailed, if you need something more high level to start with, make sure that you customize and that you select the tools that you'll be able to engage with so that they can be adopted and really useful to your chapter. I would say that it is important to adjust your membership scale. So it's different to cater to a population of 50 people compared to a population of 500 people, right? And that's important. Some of us have started at student chapters, for example, where you had other offices, a student organizations office, or maybe some more support from an advisor that's been through the process multiple times. If you're starting into this as your first exposure as a treasurer or something along the lines, make sure that you try to understand your membership scale and what's that population that you're trying to cater to. And then the meat and potatoes of this in our situation or for our chapter has really been to do multiple iterations from top to bottom. And what does that mean? What is multiple iterations from top to bottom? Is you can start in a first scenario with what has your sponsorship looked like in the past? Does it align with what you think you want to do, with how much money you'd want to raise? Is it realistic to shoot for that level of sponsorship? What is your level of risk if one of your sponsors fails? And then the next part of that would be, how do you want to spend it, right? How much are you allocating to those priorities and those objectives that you've already agreed as a board that you want to accomplish in your upcoming term? We'll show you here an example of how this iterative planning can look like. So you have some scenarios here on the right side of your screen of what could be chapter expenses, and a scenario on the left of what could be your corporate sponsorship, right? Let's assume sponsorship from corporate partners is how you're bringing in your revenue. In this case, if we were to do a bottom line calculation here, we're at a deficit, right? And that means that the chapter will have to make some very important decisions of what can be accomplished and what should be sacrificed in order to have a healthy spend that enables the following board in the next term. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that you have to cancel all those programming or all those programs. It just means that some things could be at risk. And it means that in some instances, you may have to highlight which ones do you absolutely want to accomplish or are a priority for you, and which ones would be at a risk or would potentially have to shift in how they look like to a smaller type of event or ultimately a smaller spend in order to accommodate what you have. It's also important to think of it from the other side, right? And say, maybe you don't have to sacrifice the events if you set a goal, and a goal that you can measure and track progress to reach that total expenses addition, right? So if you want to spend 13.5 for in this example, how would you approach your sponsors? And would you get a couple more sponsors? Would you increase the amount you expect to get out of each sponsor in this case? And that's an interesting, take on this, because that will give you a measurable target on how you may approach those conversations, right? What's the benefit that you're giving back to those sponsors? Is it realistic to say that you'll find 7 sponsors? Is it realistic to say that your sponsors could each be in the range of 1,000 to 3,000? Is it realistic to maybe say that you'll find less sponsors, but you'll deliver value to those sponsors so that you could put each of their contributions in the 5,000 to 10,000, right? In all of these scenarios, will play into how much can you accomplish in parallel to how much you have to bring into the chapter. And so it's an iterative approach because it'll take doing multiple rounds up and multiple rounds down to a place where the board feels comfortable to say, okay, we have a really good picture, a really good grasp of how we should go about some of the events that we want to execute and what does it take to do that from an income standpoint. Part of this ongoing process is leveraging those templates. Make sure that you have enough sections to cover everything that you will consider a financial operation. So anywhere where you would have some spend or anywhere where you would have some income operations. So a few examples, and in our previous example, I just used a corporate sponsorship. That's a really big one. It's a very, very common one, especially in our professional chapters. But also our student chapters. There's multiple ways where you can do some fundraising. You can look for partners that are not necessarily corporate, but maybe local leadership, local government, things like that, grants of certain types. They will have some commitments and some compromises that you'll have to make as a chapter if you evaluate those. But as long as they are in line with what your chapter is trying to accomplish, they may be options for you. So think about those. It's not necessarily, or it doesn't always have to be a corporate sponsorship. There's ways where you can use merchandise sale or like auction type scenarios to raise some funding. I would recommend to make sure you understand your fiscal position, make sure that if you're doing any sort of income operation of this sort, you have a very good grasp on what that means from a tax standpoint and from an IRS good standing standpoint. In terms of your annual spend, be specific about your program or your board objectives at the right level, right? And I'll show an example here in our next slide, but make sure that you have a high level budget that you can all agree to, and then by initiative, leverage each of your chairs or organizers, coordinators of the activities to break that down and make sure that we are doing responsible spending in each of those line items that you're calling out. And then a key element here is to not forget some of the administrative tasks or duties that your chapter will incur. So to give you a little bit more about a little bit more detail or maybe an example of how that could look, on the left side, here are some of the expenses that our board has considered and actually executed on in my time as a treasurer. So we have, we've bought in the past board apparel, we have office supplies, we have a PO box where we maintain our mail, we file taxes and we maintain our status. We do a ship retreat that's internal for our handoff. And then we have NELA board training, we have marketing budgets, we have a website and our Google Suite allocation. And then we budget for some miscellaneous expenses to the chapter. So things that maybe would potentially catch us off guard or we didn't see coming, and we have a cushion there, small. For the most part, you'd want to call out specific line items and maybe learn from those miscellaneous expenses from previous years to say, hey, maybe this should not be miscellaneous. We should probably plan for these sort of thing. So not necessarily internal, but how you serve your membership. You'll likely be doing ship programming or ship aligned programming and different types of events. So we have in our chapter networking events, we have a summer cookout, we have Noche de Ciencias, we have professional development, we have a gala where we award our scholarships to a group of our scholars. And then in this scenario, we're sponsoring national convention attendance. What we meant by break down your individual line item spend, it would be this case, for example, using Noche de Ciencias, right? So as an instance, when the board agrees and puts together an initial budget, you'll want to look at, okay, Noche Ciencias, let's allocate this bucket of money for that. At that point, you don't necessarily have to know exactly how everything is spent. It helps to have a realistic plan if you know more or less roughly what to expect from a previous year, or if you've seen something in a previous year and say, hey, I want something significantly larger, or maybe say, hey, we think that maybe last year we overspent or we have some lessons learned. We can trim or cut here and here. You can maybe plan less for that initiative and maybe a little bit more for a different initiative. What will come later, but it's significant and important, is that your chairs and your coordinators get to that level of detail to make sure that you're not overspending at the right time when those events happen. What can go wrong? And this is an important section. It is very unlikely that the budget, exactly as you establish it at the front of the year or at the start of your term here in July, August timeframe, will be the budget that you end up at by the next July when you hand off to the next team. So there's many things that could go wrong. There could be overspend, there could be canceled initiatives, there could be partners that drop out, sponsorship that doesn't come in as expected. Those sorts of things are hard to see coming and they're hard to plan for, but they're very, very real scenarios, right? And so think of those as you're preparing your budget and make sure that you have a plan on how to react. Make sure that you have a plan on how you're going to spend and what are your priorities to spend, and what will you do in case something that you're not planning for were to happen. A lesson learned, and we'll share this for the rest of you guys that are coming in. Some may have experienced it, some may have not yet experienced it, but spreading your major spend is huge from a risk standpoint. I was very uncomfortable as a treasurer this year. We had our scholarship awards and our Noche Ciencias. So two of our major spend points in the year, 2 weeks from each other. And that to me was a very uncomfortable position. It was a lot of risk. It was a lot of opportunity to overspend or to be under or to not really see all the invoicing happen within the right amount of time. We couldn't really close out the finance piece of one of the events before the next one started. And that's maybe something that we'll do, or that I'll try to do better in this coming year. Maybe separate those a couple months apart, or maybe try to do, if you're doing 2-3 major spends throughout the year, try to do them in the fall and the spring, or into, every 3 or so months, so that you have some cadence and so that you give yourselves enough time to bring in money, spend some money, bring in some more money, and then manage that at an attainable level over the peaks and troughs. Ensuring coverage of key administrative expenses. We've gone a little bit over some of the examples, but your chapter may be slightly different, right? There's many things that could vary. Make sure that you understand what are some of those recurring expenses, what are some of the things that are maybe local to your chapter, or maybe commitments that your chapter has, or certain scenarios where you have to pay some fees, things like that. Those can add up quick and unexpectedly in some cases. It is really, really cool and important, and it gives a lot of relief to the treasurer and to the chapter's operations when you can find some elements of control over your income. So a very, very successful way to bring in money to your chapter is through sponsorship packages, where you can establish levels, for example, of sponsorship. You can, in a way, control or predict how many sponsors you would try to go after, right? And that gives you a baseline of what is a big sponsor, what's a small sponsor, how much time are you spending chasing small sponsors. Should that maybe be revised to make sure that you're spending the right amount of time for the right amount of money that you're bringing into the chapter? And so what are some of those things that you have some control over? Keep an eye on what you offer as a recurring benefit to those partners. In some instances, that benefit can be as an expense to the chapter, and so make sure that you're maintaining that as an income, right? If you're establishing some of those partnerships and the intent is for those to bring in money to your chapter, make sure that you keep an eye on some of those things that you'll have to control to ensure it's achieving what you intended it to achieve. And then obviously this will be kind of intuitive, but it's not always necessarily easy to execute. Sometimes it takes time to develop that partnership, especially if you're building those partnerships new to the city, new to the chapter, new to that exposure as an external chair or the president going after some of these new partnerships. Make sure you time or try your best to time your spend to income positions. So if you're planning to spend a decent amount in November, try to have some income to offset that, in the first couple of months of your term, right? In the August, September, October timeframe, so that you're not going too far negative, and where possible, be positive and then start to drain your resources. That may not always be the case. And if you are going negative, then make sure you have a really, really good grasp on how negative you're going, just so that you can start to potentially close some valves or make some adjustments, maybe start to sacrifice, have some thresholds of what the board will feel comfortable with. Make it a board decision so there's alignment when things need to be sacrificed or cut for budgeting reasons. And then, you've made it this far. You've had a very, very good iterative process. You've done a lot of good income. You've managed to have sponsors, fundraising. You've done some really cool programs. Start to think, or as you do all this, think of the person that comes after. And here's where I'm extremely grateful to the person that came before me. They did a really, really excellent job at putting the structure in place for this to be something that's not a daunting task, right? So by providing regular board updates on plan versus actual, both on the income and expense side, you're actually setting the next person up as well to be able to review or reference those updates for their own planning. Make sure that you keep an eye on your fiscal status, your state reporting, your federal return or federal tax returns. You'll want to make sure that you're filing that within the due dates. You'll make sure that you'll filing that at the right level, and where needed, make sure that you're planning for any sort of spend that's related to it. So transferring banking responsibilities, that is a key element that's time bound as you hand off to the next board. Make sure that if the person handing off to you has not done so, you're very much highlighting that this has to happen. You risk bank account closures, you risk other things if it doesn't happen on a timely manner. Make sure that you have your professional chapter's address and other things like that in order and verified with your banker so that those are carried over smoothly. Transfer your budgets, your ledgers, anything that you have found historical. If you have a certain organization structure, for example, for like receipts tracking or reimbursement tracking or any of those operations that relate or have an impact in how the next person will do some budgeting, transfer those with transparency, right? In some instances, you'll have said, hey, we planned for this and actually overspent. Or in some instances, you may say, hey, we had planned for this and actually couldn't execute it. You started with a positive balance. Or, hey, you started with a positive balance, but we also made some commitments, right? And that means we now have to deliver, and you're carrying that over. Make sure that you set that next person and that next board up with the ease and the ability to be successful as you plan out your budgets and as you plan out and execute your initiatives throughout the year. That's pretty much what I had. And we just wanted to show a few of the events that the Twin Cities chapter has been able to do. You'll have seen referenced our scholarship awards. You'll see referenced some of our support to the student chapters here in Minnesota. So there's 3 undergraduate student chapters in the Twin Cities area that we've had the pleasure to work with. Really good chapters as well. And it's maybe a recommendation as professional members and professional chapters. We have a really, really good responsibility or opportunity to engage with student chapters, both from a hiring perspective, from a development perspective, from a representation perspective. So make sure you leverage those connections. And then on the left side of the screen, you'll see a couple of pictures of our Noche de Ciencias event, one of our flagship programs. It actually returned in strength. So we didn't do it in person through COVID, and then we were able to plan for it in the previous board's session, and we were able to make it grow this year. We were very excited about those. So with that, and some of the examples of the actual programming that effective and sustainable budgeting enables, I'll leave you, and I will thank you very, very much for being a part of this presentation, for taking the time to listen in, and I will see you all at the Q&A and the workshop. I look forward to both learning from you and answering any questions that you may have.